This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome to the podcast, everybody. It's good to have you with us. As always, I am Pastor Randy Moore, the Randy of the Randy and Andy Pastor Podcast, joined as always by the Andy, Reverend Andy Payton. Good to be with you again. It's Tuesday. It's snowing again.
Yes, it is.
Trying to not get negative about how this winter is going.
I've had enough. I think everyone else would agree at this point, but
we've been spoiled. We haven't. Our winters have been so mild.
Boy, we have avoided it, haven't we?
Yeah.
Last few years,
Mm-hmm.
We didn't avoid winter this year, though.
No, for the second time, or really maybe this was third decision time on church, right? The one we don't like to cancel, but had to cancel, and I believe there was another snowfall that we did not cancel for. And then on this past Sunday, many churches did. Yeah.
Well, the challenge has been the snow has come on Saturday night.
Right.
And that's not practical for us.
No.
But, I typically don't cancel unless really the ice is what gets me. When it starts icing and stuff, I'm like, nah, we can't do this. But it's very rare that I will cancel.
Yeah. Okay. We like to do a kind of a soul check-in, and you mentioned this briefly last week. You had just come off of a trip to England, and you said something in your sermon. We'll talk about it, but it made me think about when I was thinking about my soul today. You said something that's obvious, but it's also profound, and that is no matter where you go, Christ is there.
Yes.
That's good for the soul.
That's the gospel.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, Christ is already there before you got there, and our role as a people of faith is to try to see it and look for it and claim it and celebrate those signs of life. And so, if we don't see Christ working, it's our fault because Christ is there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'm sure, and you're still processing your trip.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely. Yeah, I'm trying to, it's just a lot, I landed in England, got up the next day. Well, actually, I landed in England, started touring that day, and along with the jet lag and different things. And so we just never stopped. And now I'm trying to put all those pieces together. And really what I'm trying to do is, it was not a vacation for me. It was like a continuing education type of experience. And so I'm trying to put the pieces together. And by that, what I mean is like, I'm asking the question, what's God saying to me through this experience? And what's God trying to teach me through stories of people like John Wesley? That's one of the people I'm there to learn about. And so certainly I've learned a lot the last couple of weeks, though, as I've experienced it. And one of the big things that stuck out to me about the early Methodist, particularly England, is the desperation of the people in the 1700s England. I was just telling you this about, Randy, about a statistic I read when I was in one of the museums that said in John Wesley's England, 1 in 5 children died before their second birthday. And then if you were wealthy and you made it to 50, you did good. If you're poor, you were likely to die, average age around 35. And so there's this real desperation. And that mortality, that desperation made me really stop and think about what the early Methodists were actually doing. And it really it just hit me like a ton of bricks when I remember standing there reading that plaque with those statistics on it. And I thought to myself, this is not as much about where you go when you die. It's about survival. These people are committed to survival. And they are earning the right by responding to the suffering of other people. They earn the right to tell folks about God's love. That was it in a nutshell. And so different now.
Well, we're in a 3-week series on the resurrection and in the comfort, in our own comfort and relative health. We can look at resurrection sort of academically and what is resurrection and what's bodily resurrection. But for them, they had greater in the moment concerns.
Yeah,
the church did.
Was I going to get sick tomorrow and die?
Right.
And so this is for us today. We don't think like that at all. You know, I mean, as we get older, of course, mortality starts to set in more and more, and that becomes more and more prevalent. As pastors, we're given a gift in that we are given wake-up calls because we do funerals, right? Yeah, exactly. And we see mortality. We see it, and we realize how precious and how fragile life really is. And so you better not waste it. And that's another John Wesley thing, right? Like he would say, I forget the language he used, something like trifle away your time or something like that. Don't waste your time.
Dissipate? Was it
dissipate?
Was it dissipation?
I don't know.
We've talked about dissipation.
Yeah. I mean, it just don't waste your life is really what his kind of message was. And he challenged people to go do something with it. And anyway, I know we're supposed to talk about Paul and the resurrection.
No, that's okay. Yeah, we are. We are celebrating the resurrection in February. And it's not that we do this every February, because this comes out of the Revised Common Lectionary. We've been using the epistle lessons, but we don't every year. I mean, many years we probably, if we were going to go anywhere, we'd go to the Gospels. So this isn't something we do every year. So I'm trying to sort of savor it, and I'm encouraging our people to savor it. We've got 3 weeks. It's not just Easter Sunday morning. We've got 3 weeks. So we've got the bulk of, not every verse, but we've got the bulk of the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, which is, St. Paul's writing, really most intense writing on the crucifixion, and it's the first account of the crucifixion. So we're in it for 3 weeks. I preached on the first 11 verses 2 weeks ago. Last Sunday, you preached on 12 to 20. Let me go ahead and read it, and we'll get started. Again, this is 1 Corinthians 15, 12 to 20. Now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? If there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our proclamation is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We're even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified of God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it's true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you're still in your sins. Then those who have died in Christ have perished. If for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have died. So your sermon was heavily flavored, heavily influenced by the trip.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a tour guide with Andy. Here's some of the places I went. Because I figured that's one of the things the congregation is interested in. I've been gone, and they want to kind of see it. And so I kind of did the sites, the touristy type of sites I saw. Not all together, I guess. Not everything I talked about was the tourist stuff. I mean, one of the things I loved about England and being there was that I was not on like an official trip. I was actually with a friend of mine that I went to seminary with who actually lives there. And so I got to see regular life. Mm-hmm. And when I talked about seeing Christ working in the church in England, he helped me to be able to see that. You know, I wasn't just looking at Big Ben or Parliament or these types of things. I was actually going into communities outside of London and was going into churches particularly and was able to see the kind of ministries they were doing. And so at the beginning of my sermon, I started out, with that. And here's some ways I saw Christ. And one of the big ones was, I loved this ministry. It was called Chit Chat, mm-hmm. and it was held at a church in Guildford, England. And the church was actually over 1,000 years old. I don't know if I said that in my sermon or not, but it's interesting, just the history of that building. At one point, it was very beautiful on the inside, and they would have had this ornate kind of just paintings and stuff on the walls, and then stained glass windows, that kind of thing. And the Puritans came through and literally painted it all white and knocked out the stained glass windows because those were idolatrous. Mm-hmm. And it was like the story behind the story was that Christian upon Christian violence is something very real that the English have experienced in a way that we have not really experienced as much in America. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important thing to note. Now, this church is alive and well. St. Mary's Church now is alive and well because they're doing ministry, though. And the Chit Chat ministry is for folks who have immigrated to England, who are trying to learn English And so they come in every week and they practice their English. And one of the really cool stories that I heard about was of a doctor from Syria. And of course, a lot of things have been happening in Syria in the last so many years. And so a doctor from Syria was there learning English, and he saw one of his patients that he had served in Syria across the room, and they embraced and united, and it's just, I think it's a neat story. But I feel like that's a great expression of what it looks like to practice the faith, in a world where there's a lot of questions around immigration, and there's a lot of questions around how do we serve our neighbors. And here's an expression in England of them doing it. Another way I saw Christ working was a group of British Methodists outside of Methodist Central Hall. They were standing on the street corner singing hymns. And Methodist Central Hall is kind of located right across the street from Westminster Abbey, and so it's very busy. I mean, when I was walking, and we got off the subway, we were walking up towards Westminster Abbey and going to Methodist Central Hall. One of my friends said, I think I've counted 8 or 10 different languages. Mm-hmm. And so it's very diverse. And so there you have these British Methodists singing hymns. And I went up to them and introduced myself, told them I was a pastor, and boy, they were excited about that. In fact, they even made me record a greeting for their congregation from Evansville, Indiana. And so, yeah, these are kind of ways I saw Christ working when I was there in England, though.
Yeah, and then when you did get to the lesson, the question you posed was, are we going to choose to see Christ or not? And that was behind your sermon title, Tour Guides for God. And if you're a tour guide for God, you're pointing out where God is.
Yeah, that's the idea. Like, oh, there it is, And that's the challenge of the lesson. And I will say, Randy, it's a real tongue twister.
It is.
You did it so well. But these lessons that we're reading from 1 Corinthians 15, they're just hard to read.
Paul could have used an editor.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You wonder. But it seems like some of the people were choosing not to see it anymore. Some people were saying, no, Christ is not risen, and so it's not real. And they had given in to fear and suspicion and indifference. While their world is much different than our world today, I think there's a real tendency towards that right now, where I feel like a lot of people I'm talking to, honestly, seem to be having a bit of a faith crisis. They see the way that the world seems to be going, and they're concerned. And I'm not trying to be political here. I think both sides in our political climate in the United States are worried and are struggling with their faith. And so I feel like this lesson, though written 2,000 years ago, does mirror a tendency back to us that we have, and that is our faith is fragile sometimes. And when things in the world do get scary, it's hard. And some people in this lesson, my hunch is that's kind of what they're experiencing. Mm-hmm. They're worried, and they were hoping that something was going to happen with this gospel thing, and it had not happened in the way that they wanted it to. People in the community, I think, probably were dying, and this message that they felt like was going to take place, people were going to be raised from the dead, and the kingdom of God was going to come breaking in, and it's going to be all fixed and redeemed and well, did not take place. And so they were struggling. And so, I mean, I just think it's an invitation for us to consider, how are we going to push against that tendency of fear, indifference, these kinds of things that I know, let's be honest, it's in the air right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, you placed special emphasis and pointed out verse 20, which again says, but in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who've died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, but then the cynic in me, even as I read that verse, Paul says, no, you're wrong. Christ is risen. Well, how do you prove that, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to have a hopeful worldview. I want to see the world that way. Well, how do you prove it? Well, that's a little bit easier said than done, right? I mean, what I would say, though, is we don't have a video of Jesus coming out of the tomb. We don't have a picture of it. Let's be honest. We can't prove it in the way that we would prove something today. We
don't even have an account of the actual resurrection.
No.
Yeah.
Jesus doesn't come back and say, well, this is what happened. Mm-hmm. We have witnesses. They're bearing witness. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of debate about what happened in the resurrection. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is dealing with some of that, really. Next week in our lesson, he talks about the spiritual body. What's that? Well, we're not completely sure, to be quite honest with you. And something happened, though. Something happened.
Right.
And so the reason why there is a Christianity is because they did have an experience. There's no doubt in my mind that these folks didn't just like make this story up and then go, shake the gates of the Roman Empire. I mean, they did not do that. No, something happened that inspired them to the point where they were going to bear witness to it. And so, but really for me, what the gospel invites us to do is to adopt what I'm going to describe as a love-based worldview. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's talk about some of the other worldviews first. At the end of the day, I believe, Randy, our religion is our worldview. And I get that idea from G.K. Chesterton, whom I've quoted on the podcast before. Chesterton once said, a person's religion is not the church that they belong to, it's the cosmos they live inside. And I think that there's something in that statement, in that it explains a lot of the friction and the division within religion today, especially within Christianity in America today. It's obvious that we have some big rifts. It's not just in the United Methodist Church. There's some big rifts in Christianity just as a culture right now. And so what's going on? Well, I would argue the reason we're having trouble is we're using the same language, but we have different worldviews underneath the surface. And so what are the worldviews? I'll just name them off real quick, and then I'll let the listeners decide, which ones. But so the first one I would describe, I've kind of talked about, is fear-based. When we look out the world, we see a hostile and threatening place. And so it's not just indifferent to human purposes and meaning, it's hostile to them. The world's a scary place. If a person's worldview is fear-based, then it's not a big jump for them to then begin to decide God is also someone to be feared. And so God's out to get us. If we mess up, slip up, God's going to get after us, if you will. And so if that becomes one's God, then it's not another big jump to get to that point of religious fundamentalism, which is really this impulse that humans have to figure that they got the cornerstone of God, so therefore they have the right to go impose that upon other people. To me, that's fundamentalism one-on-one. So that's the fear-based one. The second one, I would argue, is called indifference, which is more and more the modern secular worldview. And I think it does have a home in many of the churches in America today as well, although we wouldn't say it out loud. The modern secular worldview looks out at the world and says, well, the universe and the world is indifferent to human meaning and purposes. So it's not hostile to us, but it's indifferent. We're just lucky to be here. The modern secular worldview would lean heavily on science in terms of explaining how we got here. So science, of course, teaches us we evolved over millions of years, and we're the result of clashing energy forces and molecules, and we've come together over a series of events in millions of years, billions of years. And so the modern secular worldview then would, if they do believe in God, the idea here is God is somewhere else. And when we talk about God, we're kind of agnostic when it comes to God. These people, I would say some of these folks even go to church, and I would argue the indifference worldview is a little better than the fear-based one.
Oh, yeah.
It's a little different. I'll take it, if that's where we're at. If that's all we got, fear or indifference, I'm going to go indifference. The last one's love. And I think the love-based worldview has expressions within all world religions. I'm not going to say Christianity has a cornerstone on this. You can see this in a lot of other faith-based traditions outside of Christianity. I will say that. But what the world view of love says is it's gracious and life-giving. That we're not here as an accident. We're a product of a loving God, a gracious God. And so the world is friendly to human meaning and purpose. Mm-hmm. And I believe, Randy, the death and resurrection of Jesus is the invitation to adopt that love-based worldview. Why do I think that? Well, think about what it says, right? Like, the worst thing that could have happened, they killed him, they crucified him, executed him. The worst thing that could have happened, God raised him from the dead. Mm-hmm. God's love and life are greater than human evil, indifference, and fear. God's bigger than that. And so to say I believe that Christ is risen is not just this notion of where I go when I die. Jesus came, lived, and died so that when I die, I can go to heaven. No, if that's what you think is the point of Easter, you've missed the point of Easter. Mm-hmm. The point of Easter is to say, no, this world is life-giving. It's loving, and so loving and life-giving that God became one of us to prove it in that Easter moment. That's the invitation here. And so how do you convince people of that is the question. I don't have video of it. But I will say there's echoes of the story all around us. Mm-hmm. It's in the movies we watch. The hero's journey is the same story every time. The hero goes off, confronts the villain, overcomes the villain, and we say, boy, that was a good movie. Mm-hmm. It comes in so many different forms. It's in the legends that we tell. In England, the patron saint of England is St. George. He slays the dragon. What's the dragon do? Well, the dragon is taken from the people. That's the story. Mm-hmm. We see it in the statues of people that we create often. I'm not saying that's the case all the time. I mean, we've created statues of people that I would say that's probably not a good idea. But by and large, think about the people that we honor long after they're gone. It's not the wicked folks, mm-hmm. the evil folks that we honor. No. There's a song that's popular in culture now. It's from the movie Wicked, the Broadway show Wicked, where it says, "No one mourns the wicked." No one mourns the wicked. I agree. and so we're like, oh, I'm glad they're gone. Really, there's a sigh of relief. And in England, I saw statues of Martin Luther King, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Gandhi, Churchill. You just go down the line. Who are these people we remember? Well, these folks are the ones that fought that good fight. And then probably the biggest argument for a love-based worldview is just our own inner experience, which I take that from John Wesley. His father, Wesley's father, told him the greatest defense of Christianity is the inner witness. What's that? Well, I would suggest try it out, is the inner witness. Don't argue over things like virgin birth or whether or not God flooded the world or if the creation account is actually God created in 6 days, or in our case, in our podcast today, don't argue about whether or not it's a bodily resurrection or a spiritual resurrection. What a waste of time, people. What a waste of time. No, the best evidence is just go follow Jesus. Try it. Mm-hmm. And you will find that he introduces us to a power greater than ourselves. And it really won't be a big leap for a person then to become convinced of some of these stories in a new way. So anyway.
Yeah, you came back and wrapped up your sermon with the story of Lucy and the double-decker bus, which fits with your sermon title.
Yeah, I've been all over the place today. But and so what's it look like to convince people of this worldview? I think more and more the call will be for us as the church to take on that responsibility to be what the word Christian actually means, which is little Christ. That's what the word Christian really means. We're little Christ, sent out into the world to companion people on their journeys. And it dawned on me one afternoon when I was riding in one of those big red English buses, and this lady was sitting next to us. Her name was Lucy. She found out it was my first trip to England, and she began to tell me about London and her city. She said, look over there, there's the world's oldest tea house. Look over there. That's one of the only buildings that survived the Great Fire in the 1600s. Look over there. That's that statue of a dragon represents the old London versus the new London. Look over there. There's St. Paul's Cathedral. That's a sign of British resilience in the face of the Nazis in World War II. Mm-hmm. And I fell in love with England because Lucy became my guide. And I think there's something in that for us in terms of what does it mean to be evangelists today. Well, an evangelist today is not someone that's going to go out in the world and shove religion down people's throats. No, that's not going to work. We all know that's not going to work. But what an evangelist can do is be a beacon of good news. We are a people who've been convinced that God's life and love are greater than death, right? That's what we say. So we go out into a world that can be fearful. It can be indifferent. But we proclaim love anyway because we believe that's what's going to win in the end. And so we companion people along the way, and we show, number one, we show Christ in the way we live, but then we point out those signs of life. And we invite people to fall in love with the world around us, kind of like Lucy did for me. I fell in love with London because she was with me and companioned me on my way. So, yeah, I feel like that's a more practical approach to something we can do right now.
Mm-hmm. And the challenge for the congregation was to reach out to someone.
Yeah. We all have someone in our life that's gone missing. Mm-hmm. Reach out to them. Start there. Yeah. Start there. I mean, it doesn't even have to be that you're trying to get them to come to church necessarily. I mean, that would be good. I'm a pastor. I would like that. Don't get me wrong. But, I mean, you don't have to do the religious thing all the time. It starts somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Before you sat down in front of the microphone, you said you were going to print something out you wanted to share in the podcast. Did you do that? I don't think you did that yet.
I could. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you don't have to. I didn't want you to miss it if you wanted to.
Well, the reason I printed this off is, number one, it has one of my favorite quotes from John Wesley, which describes this love-based worldview. Number two, and we can end our podcast with this, I have a spiritual practice that can help a person see how my life is a part of a greater life that's loving and guiding us. Okay. And so let me do the John Wesley quote. Okay. And then I'll go into the spiritual practice real quick, which would be a fun way maybe for us to end our conversation and maybe even talk about a little bit. Yeah. So this quote from Wesley comes from the 1760s. So this is the latter half of his life. This is the second half of life, which in the spiritual world, in the faith world, a lot of good stuff happens typically in the second half of life. And so I love this. Wesley writes, "He, that is Christ, is now the life of everything that lives, and any kind or degree. He is the source of the lowest species of life, that of vegetables, as being the source of all the motion on which vegetation depends. He is the fountain of the life of the animals, the power by which the heart beats, and the circulating juices flow. He is the fountain of all life which man possesses in common with other animals. And if we distinguish the rational from the animal life, he is the source of this also." That's a love-based worldview. I mean, in a nutshell. Mm-hmm. And it comes from our own John Wesley in the 1760s. What's he saying? My life, Randy, your life is a part of a greater life that is loving and with us and guiding us, and we call that life Christ. Mm-hmm. And in our congregation here at Methodist Temple, when we say, "I see Christ in you," that's what we're saying. Mm-hmm. My life and your life, we're connected.
Yeah, and that's a message about the resurrection.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. In our lesson coming up this weekend, to kind of preview Sunday real quick, Paul says Christ is now a life-giving spirit. That's what he is, in Paul's words, not mine. Just go read it. Second half of 1 Corinthians 15, yeah. So what can we do to help us to see this life as alive and guiding us? Well, here's an activity that I will encourage the listeners to try out within their own lives. Because I think within all of us, there is a sense that my life is guiding me in a sense. I'm a part of this greater life that's guiding me. We just don't always see it. And so here's an activity, though, that I found that's helpful. It comes from Dr. Lisa Miller, who's a professor that's not a theologian from Columbia. And here's what she suggests to do. First, identify a place on the road where you faced a hurdle. A loss, a disappointment, a death, a time when the thing that you wanted, a job, a relationship, an award or an accomplishment, an acceptance letter from a particular school, seemed all to line up. It was in reach for you. And then somehow, unexpectedly, the door slams shut and you didn't get what you want or you thought you were going to get. So that's step one. We've all had those moments when the doors of our lives slam shut. So that's step one. Step two, now consider what happened as a result of the loss or disappointment that would not have happened otherwise. Because the door closed and because you didn't claw ahead and trying to force it back open, because you stopped and looked around, you saw a new door you had not noticed before. What new insight or connection or path emerged? What new doorway opened when the first door closed? That's step two. So you take the door that opens. You know, it's the old cliche in the church. Yeah. When God closes a window, the door opens or something like that. Yeah. Number three. Next, can you locate a messenger or helper that showed up? And with or without knowing, they played a role. Someone supported or guided you. Perhaps it was someone you'd never met before, someone you knew well, someone who showed up in a person or called you or sent a letter, or someone you thought of at a crucial moment and you reached out to them. Who were the messengers or helpers that pointed you to the open door? And see, now that we get back to this companioning people and guiding them, we participate in it. So, and then what Miller says to do is don't just do that activity once, do it a couple times. Go through those 3 steps a couple more times, and then you'll begin to notice a pattern. Sometimes life doesn't go our way, but new doors open up and emerge. And often those new doors that emerge lead to all kinds of gifts and insights and places that we never thought we would have gone before. And it becomes apparent that we're on a journey not of our own creation once we begin to see that. Yeah. And a person doesn't have to be religious to experience this, I don't think. I mean, if you really pay attention to it, what she's talking about, I think you become religious, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. But I think this is happening all around us. We just don't see it. Mm-hmm. And if I could try to convince people to believe in something right now, this would be the starting point, is to see our lives in a spiritual way like she's talking about. I would then go on to say, of course, that if we begin to see our lives in a spiritual way like she's talking about, it will lead to social justice, inevitably. Because I can't be a part of a life, this bigger life, and not care about your life now. Mm-hmm. If I work for your well-being, Randy, then I discover my own well-being in this worldview. Mm-hmm. And I would argue it's fairly practical and obvious that that's the way the world works best anyway.
Well, one real obvious one comes to mind for me. The door that shut was the life of my first wife, Ann. She died. That's why I'm a pastor.
Yeah.
And the messenger was George Purnell.
Yeah.
Who was my pastor, then became my district superintendent. But it was his shove into ministry. I could have come up with 100 excuses why there's no way I could be in pastoral ministry. Mm-hmm. But he gave me the nudge.
He believed in you.
Yeah. Now, I almost hesitate to tell that story because Anne had to pay a tremendous price for that. You know what I mean? But that's an obvious one.
Right.
But to continue the exercise, I'm sure I would find others that are less obvious. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I will just say, just to be clear, I don't personally believe it was God's will that Anne died.
No,
I don't think that. Mm-hmm. I don't think the gospel teaches that. Mm-hmm. Jesus himself said, basically, he desires for no one to perish. Mm-hmm. And that just means life, right? I mean, he doesn't want anyone to go through cancer or things like that. But there are doors that open as a result.
Sure.
And God continues to work in the midst of. And that's what Miller, I think, is getting at, and I think that's what Wesley and other Christians would get at. It's like, oh, yeah, things happen in this world that are not God's will every day.
Oh, yeah.
But we can take the doors that open anyway, and we don't have to lose our faith as a result of it. And that's the invitation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So for me, I would say something similar. When I was a very young man, I got into a lot of trouble, and life became difficult for me, and I hit bottom, and I came back up, and people came along the way and helped me. The big one being the church. Saw something within me that I didn't see within myself. Asked me to preach, which at that time, if you would have known me in my early 20s, that would probably have been the first thing you would think of with Andy Payton. But yeah, it happened. Yeah. So, sure.
Death and resurrection.
Always. Never death avoided. It's death transformed.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, very good. We will look forward to this third Sunday where we delve into the first, in 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter on resurrection. So thank you so much for being a part of our podcast. We appreciate the fact that you've listened. Hope you have a great week, and we'll talk to you again next time.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.